No. So actually, we could turn the lights back on, except that the third talk needs to be using the projector.
It's okay. This comes in
She's about 20 minutes. Okay. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. This is the last session for the day. After this, there's a reception. So hopefully we'll have some very interesting talks today. So just to give you a sense of the lineup, I'm going to start with talking about challenges of sustainability in ICT for development. Jennifer Bussell from UC Berkeley is going to talk about how norms in ICT for development are different based on larger organizations that think about these things and what you actually see on the ground. Casper Jensen is going to present on development in action, information technologies as globalization agents. And that's followed by Janine Firpo from Semba Consulting, who used to be earlier with HP in how ICTs go from early adoption to mainstream usage. And finally, Dipendra Manocha will be talking about accessibility issues. Okay, so I'm going to start. And my talk is called Challenges in ICT for Development. And as far as ICT for development is concerned, just to give everybody background, this is really at some level what all of WSIS is about. And I think of this as being, as trying to answer two different questions. The first one is whether information and communication technologies can support or catalyze socioeconomic development, definitely for poor communities, but overall underserved communities, wherever there might be. And then also whether or not that can be done in a financially, politically, and socially sustainable way. And I would say that the answer to the first question is definitely yes. There have been many, many examples throughout the history of development where technology has made an impact. And just to give you one example, I'm going to talk about rural PC kiosks. But this is an example where, a fairly well-known example, where in 2002, an okra crop was saved, largely because there was a PC kiosk set up in the village that allowed the villagers to communicate with an agriculture extension office. And as a result of the fact that the agriculture experts were able to diagnose an okra crop with a particular kind of disease, they were able to relay back the actual remedy. It was estimated that something like $3,000 worth of okra crop was saved in that particular village. So this is an example where ICT made a critical difference, and at $3,000, that's more than made up for the cost of the PC that was installed in the first place. Okay, now as for whether you can do this in a sustainable way, I think that has yet to be proven in a time-tested way. I would say certainly nobody has a formula for how to make a particular technology or pilot program scale out in a way that is affordable. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk about this particular issue by focusing on a particular kind of project, which are these rural PC kiosks. And by no means are they representative of all ICT projects, but I think there's some interesting lessons that you can learn from this particular example. So one of the interesting things about this is that, at least in India, these projects have become really big. Large organizations like the government of India have taken notice of them in a very big way. They're hoping to roll out something like 100,000 kiosks over the next several years. That's a sixth of all the rural villages in India. Earlier projections were actually to do it for every village in India, and they decided to scale back based on the cost that they projected. Okay, but there's a lot of hope placed on these projects, and there's a certain amount of hype that goes along with it as well. So at Microsoft Research in India, we've done quite a bit of sort of background study to understand how these kiosks work. We've done ethnographic studies as well as surveys of lots and lots of kiosks and kiosk customers. Obviously, fairly thorough literature review as well as a number of site visits. I myself have visited something like probably 40 or 50 rural village kiosks. And in each one, you find that there's certain patterns that emerge. Okay, so this is, the picture on the left is of a boy typing. He's taking typing classes. And this particular kiosk, the man who was running the kiosk said that he could make a lot of money simply by offering typing courses to kids in the village. And parents would actually pay a reasonable amount of money for this particular service. In this case, they were paying the kiosk operator 200 rupees, which comes to about $4 per month for this 12-year-old child to take 2 hours of typing lessons every week. And it doesn't sound like a lot of money to us, but for somebody who might be earning, let's say, $100 per month, $4 is quite a bit. Okay, now the interesting thing about this kiosk is literally months after I had visited, this particular kiosk has closed. And what happened was that the kiosk operator wasn't able to sustain this particular business. In other words, once the kids had typing lessons, there was no next thing that he was able to offer them that their parents were willing to pay for. Okay, this is another kiosk. In this case, there was a man who ran a print shop in a village of about 5,000 people, and they decided that they wanted to add an internet connectivity to their business, and so that's exactly what they did. And same story there. So since the time that we visited this particular kiosk, it too has closed. And in this case, one of the difficulties was that the kind of services that the kiosk offered were connectivity to the government. And so they allowed things like applications for birth certificates, death certificates, motor vehicle licenses, and so forth. And what happened was there was a change in the local government, which suddenly decreased the amount of support they were getting from the government for this particular project. And as a result of that, they were no longer able to supply the particular services that they were initially supplying, and the kiosk closed down. The print shop is still there. Okay, third example. This is of a project in Tamil Nadu where, again, there's a rural kiosk. Some of you may have heard of Nlog. This is a fairly well-known kiosk company in India. And on the one hand, they're very good at scaling. I believe the last count is something like they have 1,000 kiosks throughout the country. But if you go back and investigate, it's often the case that most of the kiosk operators are finding it hard to actually break even. So this is some work with a student at IIT Bombay. And what you see is monthly revenue plotted on the y-axis and across 13 different kiosks in Maharashtra, which is one of the states in India. And this pink band that you see in the middle is sort of the amount that's estimated that you need to make in revenue in order to break even running a kiosk business. And you can see that there are only about 5 kiosks that are actually anywhere within the band, and of those, maybe 2 or 3 are doing really well. This one in the middle that's doing very well, nearly 18,000 rupees of income, is actually a computer training center. So if you actually go there, you find that he has 5 or 6 PCs all lined up, and he runs a very lucrative computer education school, not so much a kiosk where he's providing services to poor farmers. And that's actually a pattern that you see over and over. The ones that are successful, so this magenta color actually indicates revenue generated based on computer education courses, and those tend to be something that parents are willing to pay for and which make a reasonable amount. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit next about why these kiosks are hard to sustain. And when you are in this space, you hear a lot about things like there's lack of content, there's lack of services, cost of the PC is one of the other things. And all of those things are true. I want to address the ones that I think are really critical. So the first one is high total cost. So if you look at the minimum cost of a PC, it's actually very, very difficult to get it below $200 US. And this is in spite of significant technological advances of various different kinds. Obviously, Moore's law means that processor speed increases, but it doesn't say anything about the price of the actual processor. And in fact, there's sort of you can imagine that there's sort of a rock bottom price for making any chip simply because of the cost of setting up the manufacturing plant as well as the raw parts and so forth. And so if you consider that that's the case for every part in a PC, whether it's the power supply or the keyboard and mouse, and add all those things up, it comes to about $200 US. Now, there are stories that you hear, and there are people who are trying to create lower cost PCs, but ultimately the ones that you see actually on the market tend to hit this barrier, tend to hit the $200 US barrier. There are certain cases where people are projecting $150, even $100 PCs or laptops. And in those cases, what you'll find is that they are also promising a significant technological breakthrough. And I would say in order to get from 200 to 100, you need several significant technological breakthroughs to get to that point. And one question is, if you make those kinds of breakthroughs, whether your primary interest will be in rural villages or not. And the other problem is that people often think of the hardware cost as being the main cost for a PC, for running a PC. But it turns out that hardware cost is maybe a fourth of the actual cost it takes to sustain a running PC over time. So if you amortize the cost of a PC over, let's say, 5 years, and then consider things like power, electricity, connectivity, and maintenance, those other components cost almost as much over time as the hardware for the PC. And PC cost itself is not a one-time expenditure. You need to replace it every few years, particularly if you're in a hot, humid, dusty environment. And so all of these things add up, and the cost of maintaining a single PC can go anywhere from between $45 to $130 US. Okay, so this is a cost that's significant for somebody who is intending to make a business in a very poor village where the average person may not make more than $300 or $400 a year. Okay, now the other thing about cost is that no matter how you slice it, the cost challenges scale with the size of the project. And so it's not as if you can do this, if you can comfortably do this in one village, that automatically means that you have the funds to start it in other villages. And in fact, this is exactly the problem that the Indian government is facing right now. They would like to have kiosks available in every one of their 600,000 villages, but that can mean, assuming it's a $1,000 investment every year, up to $600 million per year. And it's an ongoing cost. It's not something that you can expect to pay once and then never have to worry about again. Of course, that's different if you have a sustainable business, and so I want to talk next about why it's difficult to have a sustainable business around. If you go to any rural village in India, and I believe this is true, at least it's similar in other places I've been in Africa, you find that there are people who have run small petty stores, and they sell everything from soap to food to buckets for carrying water and so forth. And they're thriving. They're doing a reasonable business. And one thing about them is that they're delivering very clear value to the community. So there's no doubt that if you need soap or if you need food and so forth, that you can go to the shop and get these things. And so the store owner has a very strong incentive to continue running this kind of business, and the village benefits from having something like this. Okay, so the value is very clear. Now the incremental value of the PC, so by the way, I work for Microsoft, which means that I would very much like to believe that the value of a PC is high. Okay, but the fact is, for life in a village, it's not entirely clear that the individual things that you could do with a PC are significant leaps above what you can do to meet particular needs that you might have in a rural village, above and beyond what they already have. So, for example, email. It might be great if you have email, but for example, the postal service at least in many countries, is actually well developed. You can get mail. It might take 2 weeks longer than you would like, but most villages are not in a rush to receive email. It's very rare that something is critical and needs to be delivered overnight. In fact, you can if you think about it, just 15 years ago, services like FedEx did not exist, and we did perfectly well having mail crawl through the regular postal system. Voice over IP is often mentioned as a viable application. And I think this is true, especially in environments where a large part of the community goes abroad. But when that doesn't happen, it's not entirely obvious that people need to be able to make phone calls that are cheaper than whatever rate they're able to get over regular payphone. Games is another application, and actually there are a few kiosks that I've been to where you find kids actually, I'm not sure where they get the money, but they find a way to earn enough money that they can play games at a kiosk. But there too, there are other ways, there are other forms of recreation. It's not something that parents are going to pay money for just so that their kids can play games. Telemedicine is another thing that people mention, and again, it's actually quite surprising how much penetration there is in rural areas for things like rural health clinics, as well as roving doctors who go out and make calls. Obviously, these services are not great; they're not fantastic. But it's not as if by providing an internet connection, all of a sudden you can cure all the health problems in the village. And so you can go on and on and on. And so I would say that the incremental value of a PC in a particular village has not yet been demonstrated. It might be that there's some magical application that's out there, but we have not yet really hit on it. Okay, and then finally there's a list of social political challenges. And by that I mean that the people all the people that you need to back something like a large-scale PC rollout into villages have some incentives that conflict with having that happen. I'm just going to highlight a couple of these. So one of the really difficult things for being a kiosk operator is that if you're in it to run it as a business, you have to make a very hard choice between, are you going to try to serve social needs in the village, or are you going to cater to the wealthier people in the village who will actually help you make income? And that trade-off is actually, it really is a trade-off. So it's very easy for us to believe that for us living in villages, that villagers are very much alike, and that there's not a lot of differences within the village. But when you actually go and visit these places, you realize that there's just as much variance in the population in terms of wealth and culture in a village as there is in a city. So for example, if you do cater to the people who really need help, whether it's to connect with the government, to avail themselves of government schemes and so forth, and work with them, then that tends to alienate the crowd who begins to see, the wealthier crowd who begins to see your kiosk as a place for getting various kinds of social help. And so they tend not to visit. And then the flip side is that if you actually focus your energy on trying to get income, that tends to alienate the people in the village who think that they need services that are free. And so it's very difficult to simultaneously brand a single kiosk in such a way that it's meeting social needs and presenting itself to an upscale market. And the analogy that I think of is, it's very difficult to have a homeless shelter that is also a four-star restaurant. The people who go to a four-star restaurant are not interested in going to a homeless shelter for food, and people who go to homeless shelters would probably be intimidated by the restaurant. So I think there's a similar dynamic, and it's very difficult to do that. Okay, so now having said all of these things, having said all these depressing things, I'm going to mention a few instances of technology for development that have been successful, just to indicate that it has been done, and I don't think we should give up. So one example that I heard about recently from a professor at UC Berkeley, Isha Ray, is that of hand pumps. So in the late 1960s, there was a severe drought in India. And as a result of that, that sort of propelled a bunch of different groups to try to figure out a way to make sure that people have access to water. And apparently there's a definition where if you are within 1 kilometer walking distance to drinking water, that counts as access to water. And so as a result of a number of different interventions, starting with the government, who made a huge push for this and basically said, we will pay companies a huge amount of money for developing hand pumps that will basically be cheap and will work and last over time. And as a result, a number of Indian companies rose to the challenge and did in fact develop these pumps. And apparently the technology in India is now such that they have the cheapest, most reliable hand pump drilling technology in the world. And over a period of 25 years, penetration of these pumps has gone such that from starting with 10% in the late 60s to 86% now, basically 86% of the population of India can claim, of rural India can claim to be within 1 kilometer of access to drinking water. So that's a considerable success, and I think it's the kind of level of success that we would like to see with ICTs and with information. There's similar figures for television and public call offices, which I'm not going to discuss. And then a really interesting example recently is obviously with mobile phones. So mobile phones are really interesting in that I think they sort of provide this great example of technology that has very clear value to the customer. And it's something that we tend to forget, but it's not as if mobile phones appeared out of nowhere. You know, there were, I think, let me see now. 20 years ago, I can remember there used to be car phones, which are basically based on the same initial technology, but which were these lumbering things that weighed about 2 or 3 pounds. You had to install it in the car. You need this huge external antenna out in the back, and the service cost probably dollars a minute. And over time, all of that, the technology has evolved to a point where they're economical, they're small, they fit in your pocket, and so forth. And so some things happen where the affordability is at a point where people do want phones. And in fact, what's amazing is the rapid penetration of these phones in even in developing countries. The other thing is that it did require a shift in business model for it to really reach let's say the last billion people that it has been reaching. And that is the shift from going from subscription, which worked in developed countries, and pushing a prepaid model where you would have to pay for the service before you actually got the talk time. And especially, this was actually dramatic in Latin America, where penetration was actually going along at a reasonable pace, but then when they introduced prepaid, you saw this huge elbow in the penetration of mobile phones. And the other interesting thing is that the impact is very clearly demonstrable. So this is a graph that was plotted by Rob Jensen, who's a professor at the Kenya School of Government. And he had the insight to actually start tracking a certain kind of statistic over time before mobile phones were implemented. So on the Carolina coastline, there are these fishing communities where they go out to fish, and then in the evening they come back and sell their fish on the shoreline. And it turned out that even within a stretch of about 30 miles, there were these different fish markets, and where the variance in the price of the fish was dramatic initially from market to market to market. And so the fishermen had to play this guessing game as far as which market would still have customers that were interested in buying fish and so forth. And with the introduction of those, just let me explain this graph. So this fuzzy line here indicates, you can think of this as the total amount of fish that was wasted as a result of fishermen not finding customers. Okay, and then this red line indicates the day that they installed the first mobile phone tower in that area. Okay, and what's happened is that immediately after that point, right, this time is measured in weeks, so it's maybe a couple weeks, they saw that the variance in market price of the fish basically flatlined. It went from being completely chaotic to effectively being the same across all the markets. And as a result of that, there was a reliable price of fish that that was constant across all the markets, and fishermen no longer had to choose which market to go to. And as a result of that, they no longer found themselves dumping fish that they couldn't sell. And so you can think of the integral under this line as being the total amount of economic waste as a result of not being able to sell fish. And that's basically gone to zero with the introduction of the mobile phones in that area. So this is, so I would say this is a really dramatic show. And ideally, if we believe computers, PCs have that kind of impact, this is the kind of impact that we'd like to be able to demonstrate. So with that, I'm just going to mention a few of the characteristics that I think are prevalent in most of the technologies that we've seen deployed successfully. One is that the value has to be absolutely clear to the end user. And by absolutely clear, I mean it doesn't require half an hour of explanation to explain. If you say this is a mobile phone, it allows you to talk to your friend no matter where they are, I think that value is very clear. It's a little bit unclear when you say, okay, if you use this device, it allows you to apply for a birth certificate, but then you still have to go to the office to pick up the actual physical certificate. It's not quite as clear. The other thing is that crises often play a catalytic role, and I would say so far we haven't felt like there hasn't been a single event that defines a crisis for lack of information. There have been certain stories where certainly the information being there has actually helped dramatically, but there hasn't been a crisis that people feel. And then the other thing is that large organizations almost always play some part in the effort to scale out. And that's something that I think is important to remember in that, whether it's governments or large corporations or very large NGOs or international organizations like the UN, it really helps to have somebody very large and powerful back the idea. And so I think it's one thing to start a pilot project. It also helps to be able to take those ideas and sell them in such a way that large organizations will become involved. Okay, with that, I'd like to say thank you.
May we have some light, please?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, let me take just 2 questions.
Well, I have a lot of problems with your presentation.
Okay.
Well, let's take a tale for starting, when you go in the coast of Kerala, you will see that the fish is not sold by the man, but by women in the seacoast.
Right.
So I would like to, well, I'm worrying that Professor Jensen is saying that. The question of visiting the country. Second is about the value for cost, as you said. And you mentioned the IP, games, telemedicine, e-government, email, etc. Well, I have been several times in villages in India, especially in very poor states like Orissa or Madhya Pradesh, I don't see how villages could find some value for cost with VoIP, with telemedicine, with e-government. Not at all. Well, so we must have a realistic view of what an Indian village is.
Absolutely.
Third, and that would be the only one question, well, I don't know why you haven't mentioned the new device that has been built in India, which is a computer.
Right. Okay, so let me add.
And the computer is trying to face the real problems of people now.
Let me address all 3 of those questions. So, as to the first, I do, this was not my study, but I do have faith in Rob's methodology, and I think, whether they were actually sold by the men or the women, he's basically abstracted that aspect out. The prices in these markets have stabilized to an extent that is really remarkable, and I don't think there's any doubt on that front. Number 2 is that I agree with you. It's not clear that the value for some of these services that we believe would make a difference to villages is really there. And I think that's something that we definitely.
That is not the first needs of people,
Excuse me?
These are not the first needs of people. The felt needs of people.
Right, I agree. And so
that is important needs.
I agree with you.
But it's technology push,
I'm completely in agreement with you. And I think we either need to find more relevant applications, or we need to look for a different technology that makes a difference. And on the third point, as far as the computer goes, so the computer has not picked up dramatically in India, and it's not. And in fact, just the other day I was talking to Swami Manohar, who is one of the drivers behind the computer, and he said something very interesting, which is that there's two reasons why he felt that it didn't work. And if you talk to him today, he will say the initial way we pitched the computer was wrong. And what he basically says is that we could not get the cost down to the point that we thought would make a difference. Number one, it was simply from a manufacturing point of view, it was impossible to do. And the second thing was that it's very difficult to describe the value of this thing above and beyond a regular PDA, which again, because it was about the same cost, why the device itself was unique enough that people would feel the need to buy these in large number when they could get a bulk order of something that was manufactured in much larger quantities elsewhere. And so he couldn't make the case for value. And right now what he's trying to do is basically going to people and making business case about why an investment in this particular technology will make a huge difference. And they've also worked a lot on the UI for the device so that it makes, he has a story to tell that goes beyond the cost of the device. So
I met him also a couple of months ago.
Yeah, so I think the more experiments we have, the better. I mean, we have to try all of these things, but the fact is these are very difficult. They're very, very difficult to actually make work in a way that actually makes a difference to the communities that we're trying to impact. And the only thing I would have to say is, we just have to keep trying. We have to keep trying with different models, trying with different hardware, trying with different partners, everything that's required to try all the different things. And I don't think we've exhausted it by any stretch. Yes, let me take one more question.
Okay, I want to use the opportunity to say fantastic presentation. I think it's the first one in probably 3 or 4 years since 4S in Milwaukee or someplace like that someone has really given this realistic overview of the rural situation there. And tomorrow, because we were mentioning Kerala, this is a kind of the plug. We have a special session on Kerala with a couple of current and former IT ministers that are basically promoting the rural kiosk technology, and there's not a lot of actual empirical data on it, but there's a lot of promotion. We had one individual whose paper I guess will be read by someone else that is a bit more critical. So a special session on Kerala tomorrow to deal with some.
Fantastic. All right, thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to Jennifer.
My much less colorful presentation. I think Carlos making me look very bad here. Okay, so my name is Jennifer Bissell, and I'm a PhD candidate in political science at the University of California, Berkeley. And I am, not in my spare time, but I am also a researcher on a project that's based in the computer science department at Berkeley to actually develop technologies for use in developing countries. And we've done a reasonable amount of work in Kerala looking at the Akshaya project as well. But today what I want to do is take the level of analysis up a little bit and think about what's going on at the international level, not just this week, but over the course of the last 10 years, in thinking about the potential for using information and communication technologies for development. So before I dive into the details, I just want to talk about the overview of what I'm going to talk about. So I want to talk about the general rise in international attention to ICTs for development. And then I'm going to present some new data that I've gathered on the extent or lack thereof on international norms with regard to ICTs and development. And then I'm going to talk about the relevance, or again, the lack thereof, of these norms at the domestic level among actors who are actually working to promote these technologies on the ground. And then we'll discuss a little bit the reasons for the disconnect that I'm going to talk about between the international and domestic levels. And then consider some thoughts for moving forward in research on these issues. So, as we all know, because we're here today, there's been an important shift in the last 10 years in the international development agenda to focus more on ICTs as potential tools for development. And this has involved the activities of many international organizations and multilaterals, such as the World Bank, the UN Development Program, other actors such as the Markle Foundation and the Global Knowledge Partnership, to understand and promote ICTs as tools for political, social, and economic development. But the question that I want to pose to you today is what effect that these activities have actually had on the ground. And I categorize the efforts of international actors in 2 ways, in terms of investment and then discursive activities. And so what I'm going to focus on today is those discursive activities. And by that, I mean efforts to promote discussion and debate about ICTs rather than actual monetary investments in projects on the ground. So the examples of this would be things such as the UNCTAD E-Commerce and Development Report, the World Bank's InfoDev reports, and this week's World Summit on the Information Society. So the question then is, in all of the different reports produced by these organizations over the course of the last 10 years, what consensus at all has developed on the ways in which ICTs can be used for development, and what other themes emerge in these reports? And then secondly, to the extent that there is some consensus, what role does this consensus have on the ground, and how is it affecting how developing country actors actually attempt to implement these technologies? So those are the questions that I'm going to focus on today. So I'll just give you a quick background to the data set that I put together to attempt to do this effort. And so what I did was I collected reports from 10 different organizations, every organization that I could find that had produced some sort of general report on ICTs for development. And I collected them over the time period 1994 to early 2005. And I ended up with 109 reports. And then I took a purposive sample, which just means that I took one report from every organization in every year that they produced a report. So the idea was to get coverage both across time and across all the organizations to the extent that I could without killing myself by reading 109 reports. And then what I did was I posed 6 questions to these reports as I read them. What I was trying to understand was, first, what technology specifically did they actually promote for use in development? Then how did they think that those technologies could be used? What goals did they think could be achieved through the use of those technologies? Then which actors did they think should participate in terms of national governments, non-profit actors, private sector actors, etc.? What barriers and risks did they see to actually implementing these goals and technologies? And then what potential strategies did they foresee for overcoming those risks? So I'm just going to talk through some of the initial findings. And when I'm talking about these, what I'm generally discussing is the percentage of reports that mentioned a particular theme. So in a given report, if they mentioned poverty reduction as a goal for ICTs in development, that counts as a mention for that report. And I'm comparing them in terms of the number of times they were mentioned in the reports from between 1994 and 1999, and then the period 2000 to 2005. And also there's a little bit of comparison where it seems relevant across years from 2000 to 2005. And I'm just going to preface this by saying that among those of you, who is probably all of you, who have spent some time thinking about these issues, these aren't going to sound like the most surprising things necessarily. They're going to sound relatively obvious, but the perspective, my perspective and reason for doing this is I didn't see that anyone had actually tried to take this kind of rigorous approach to analyzing the norms or lack thereof that have been developing at the international level. So this is the first attempt to do that. So what are the trends that we see? In reality, there weren't that many norms about what technology should be used. So over time, there was a trend in discussion from just talking about networking, so national networking, not really linking to international networks at all, just getting computers linked to each other, to more focus on advanced connectivity solutions and specific technologies such as voice over internet protocol and Wi-Fi. And then there was also a consistent emphasis in terms of technology and issues related to technology on local content. And then in the second period, past 2000, there was more emphasis on adapted technology specifically to the needs of developing country environments. Now, in terms of the uses for technology, relatively unsurprisingly, the most common arguments for using ICTs are for exchange and access to information. But it was only really in the second period that we saw an emphasis on specific kinds of information, and in particular market information and government information, or access to information about government services. And then more surprisingly, I would say, is that given what I'm going to tell you about next, which is the emphasis on the use of these technologies for social development goals, there isn't that much discussion in these reports on the specific ways in which these tools can be used for social development. So what are the goals of ICTs for development? As opposed to the means to the ends, which is what I was just talking about, the uses for these technologies, these are the goals for using these technologies, the ends in and of themselves. And I break down development here into three different kinds, so economic development, social development, and then political development. And in terms of economic development, really the dominant themes are, again, not that surprising, but economic growth, and then secondarily, international competitiveness for local industries. And so, again, the percentages that you have here for each of these are the percentage of these 39 reports that mentioned that particular theme. And then in terms of social development, here there's this emphasis really on a wide variety of things: healthcare, education, poverty reduction, and improvements in environmental standards and conditions. But the thing here is that of all of the themes mentioned that I'm going to talk about today, this had the highest rate of mentions, is these particular social development issues. As you can see, healthcare and education in particular, and then poverty reduction. And then finally, in terms of political development, there's less mention of this, but there is significant mention of political and government access related development issues. And the most prominent one is access to government services, and this is what we do see in a lot of the telecenter projects as the types of services that they're trying to implement in these telecenters. And then in the earlier period, but less so recently, there was more focus on participatory decision making and then trying to build a more transparent government. And then there is some attention, though I wouldn't say it's significant, to the types of actors that we hope to, or that these organizations hope to see involved in these projects. And in the 1994 to 1999 period, the significant emphasis was on national governments, and I think this is in part because there was a lot of emphasis on regulatory issues. and then on multilaterals. Whereas in the latter period, this has been expanded to a broad range of organizations, private sector actors, NGOs, academia, etc. So I'm just going to touch briefly on a few of the areas in which these reports highlight the potential barriers and risks to implementing these technologies, and then some of the strategies that they propose. And I won't talk about all of these, but if you have questions on any of these, we can also talk about them. So in terms of technology, the key technical barrier that's been mentioned is the lack of local technical expertise. And this is for participating and supporting ICT projects. And most of the reports in attempting to solve this recommended increasing technical training both at a general level in schools and also in specialized technical institutes. And in terms of regulatory barriers to the implementation of these technologies, the most frequently mentioned barrier was telecommunications monopolies. And this was particularly important in the early period, or the late 1990s. And then the overwhelming recommendation for getting rid of this was privatization and liberalization of the dominantly monopoly and state-owned telecommunications companies in most developing countries. And then in terms of implementation, what I think is one of the most interesting things to observe in these reports is that in the last 5 years, there's been a move to think about implementation and strategies to improve implementation that you really didn't see in the first period when people were simply just excited and wanted to get things going on the ground. And so as organizations began to realize that there's actually very little data out there that rigorously analyzes project experiences and success on the ground, you actually see people having a lot of trouble moving pilots to widespread or scaling up of those projects, and people started thinking about what they needed to do to make that scaling up more feasible. And so now analysts are arguing that there needs to be both monitoring of projects to see whether or not they're successful, and then also evaluation and then monitoring and tracking of projects so that more information can be shared about what's happening on the ground between initiatives. And then finally, the last thing that you see there is a discussion about development integration. And this is one of, I would say, the most powerful arguments being made about ICTs for development right now, which is that in order to make these projects successful, they simply have to be integrated into broader development initiatives. And this isn't necessarily something that we've seen over most of the last 10 years. And so this is now called mainstreaming of ICTs. And the idea is that these projects need to be implemented into the broad national development strategies and subnational development strategies of developing countries. Otherwise, they're not going to see any real success on the ground. So what I want to talk about now is how and whether these themes that have emerged internationally have had any effect on what we see on the ground. And the two countries that I'm going to talk about, simply because they're the two that I know about, are India and South Africa. They also happen to be two of the countries in the world that have seen the most initiatives, in particular telecenter or kiosk initiatives, to implement technologies on the ground. And I'm, just for time constraints, only going to cover 3 of the areas for which I've discussed international norms: the regulatory strategies, the incorporation of ICTs into the broader development agenda, and then also the efforts to evaluate and track projects. And so, based on what I've discussed so far, there would be a couple different expectations that we would have if these norms had been fully implemented on the ground. So we would expect to see privatized and liberalized telecommunications companies. We'd also expect to see national governments with ICT efforts fully integrated into their national development strategies, perhaps through poverty reduction strategy papers. And then finally, we'd expect to see efforts to track ICT initiatives and also develop monitoring and evaluation programs for them. So while I don't have time to go into the details of these cases, I'd be happy to answer questions about either of them in terms of their details, but luckily for me, the cases are actually relatively similar, and so I can summarize them briefly. So in the case of regulatory strategies, you've really seen very turbulent and incomplete liberalization and privatization in both these countries. The telecommunications monopolies have been somewhat liberalized and somewhat privatized, but that's clearly not complete in either country. And you do see much more liberalization or much more competition in the mobile phone sphere. There are 3 to 5 mobile phone operators in each of these countries, but that's not helped the effort to liberalize the landline situation. And in terms of incorporation into the development agenda, the focus in both of these countries is on developing the information technology industry, on providing incentives for growing the IT industry. While this isn't as fully developed in South Africa as it clearly is in India, the effort is there. But at the same time, you really don't see a lot of national effort to develop ICT access strategies. I think the exceptions here are the new Mission 2007 project in India and efforts in both countries to implement ICTs into education. But the strange thing about education in both these countries, not strange, but what happens is that strategies are proposed at a national level, but action is taken at the provincial or state level. And so there's a wide variety in the actual efforts to introduce technologies in education across the two countries. And where you see efforts in other areas such as health or agriculture, most of that is really driven by the private sector rather than the national government. And then in terms of evaluation and tracking, you don't see much. The Department of Information Technology is supposed to track all of the efforts in India, but they really seem only to track their own projects. And Bridges.org, which is a private non-governmental organization in South Africa, does some tracking as well, but none of this is very consistent or overreaching, or far-reaching. So, given that I'm presenting this, what seems to be a reasonable disconnect between the international level and the domestic activities, why do I think this is the case? So I'm going to present a couple of hypotheses here. I haven't actually yet tested any of these hypotheses on the ground, but I do think that they're reasonable based on other case experience and our observations of these two cases. So what are some of the things we might think about in trying to understand why we don't see these activities on the ground matching the international level? The first and relatively important thing is domestic institutions. So regardless of the character or the strength of international norms, any effort to follow these norms domestically is going to require negotiation of the particular institutional environment in the country. And by that, I mean simply the laws and rules, including those that exist for governing telecommunications and technology, the participation of non-government actors in these activities, policymaking procedures, and the structure of the bureaucracy. So whether or not a particular reform or strategy can be implemented is often seen as dependent on the character of these domestic institutions. Secondly, entrenched interests. This is something that Kentaro referred to, and I think that regardless of whether you even have a sort of supportive institutional structure, the barriers based on who might lose out on the basis of any reform are obviously important to consider. The best example here that I would provide are the unions that support telecommunications workers. In both India and South Africa, the unions supporting telecommunications workers have played a very important part in preventing the full liberalization and privatization of the telecommunications companies. And I'm not making a normative statement about that, whether that's good or bad, that just seems to be the way that it is. And then finally, the difficulty simply of implementation. You may have the support of actors, and you may have a good institutional environment, but this stuff is just difficult. We haven't figured it all out. We don't know exactly what's going to work. And so making these things happen on the ground just isn't simple. So the point of this talk isn't really to say that we might as well all go home and just skip the rest of this conference this week because what you do at the international level doesn't matter. That's not the point. While there are some clear norms about the uses and goals of ICTs for development, I think it's also interesting to give attention to the fact that these norms are dynamic over time. They're changing as we have more experience with these technologies on the ground. And to a certain extent, it's actually surprising that there's any reasonable consensus at all, given that we're working with new technologies, the new experience are driving these things, and all of these international organizations have different development agendas. The fact that we do have some consensus on telecommunications liberalization, on incorporation into the development agenda, and on monitoring and tracking is actually sort of almost a surprising step. So in terms of the effects of international ICT4D norms on domestic activities, I've provided a few hypotheses as to why I think that this disconnect exists, but this isn't, again, to say that there's no link here at all. Clearly, actors on the ground are considering what are many of the same issues that people are considering internationally. And what I think is then the prime sort of topic for moving this forward and thinking about how we might research the connections between the international and domestic levels further is to consider what the specific mechanisms are by which what's happening internationally and domestically is linking to each other. How actors, be they specific actors or groups, are contributing to the international discussion and debate, and how that gets filtered, that knowledge gets filtered back down into the domestic level. And by doing so and thinking about these mechanisms, then we'll be able to better understand how the mechanisms of transmission interact with local characteristics to produce specific outcomes on the ground. So what I think is really going to be interesting to see and analyze over the next few years is going to be how these discussions at the international level evolve, and in particular how the energy on ICT for D gets blended into broader discussions of development, and whether these discussions begin to have additional influence on what's actually happening on the ground.
In your list of hypotheses, have you considered that maybe one of the obstacles is also the interest of institutions that are behind these international norms, that is not necessarily local, but it's not everybody at the international level has the same power to decide what we're going to do.
That's important. And actually, one of the analyses that I didn't present was I looked at each of the different organizations individually and tried to understand which norms they were promoting, in the sense that you could easily hypothesize that the World Bank would have more power on driving international norms than maybe the Markle Foundation or some other institution, and that given the power of particular countries that are driving the efforts of those organizations. I didn't find anything really specific that was worth commenting on, but I think it's a really important point and think it's something to consider. Yeah.
Can you please report which of the organizations you analyzed? The background of my question is the following. I'm a bit surprised, and possibly the reports are not fairly judging this, that the difference between South Africa and India is so small. Indeed, you of course know that in the late 70s, India decided on the government level to ban IBM software and hardware import into government and related institutions. And this was the cause of the Indian software industry, big effort into education, which now leads to the fact that India is the biggest outsourcer for Northern Hemisphere, that they have excellent research activities, and I think especially also the cyber cities are government project. I think that if you come to the conclusion that the reports evaluate similarly South Africa, where nothing similar has been experienced on that level, and India, then you should question the reports, the fairness of the reports.
Well, I'll clarify, actually, the reports that I used were all general reports just discussing ICTs for development, and the analysis of the two countries is my own. So that's just based on my own research, and it's not connected to the specific reports that I looked at. And also, I think because I wasn't focusing specifically on the IT industry, there's a huge discrepancy in the character of the IT industry in South Africa and in India. And I'm sure that that's related to exactly the activities that you're talking about. And what I was paying a little bit more attention to was the attention of the government to activities outside the IT industry itself and sort of efforts to promote access beyond that. But just to answer the beginning of your question, and I might forget some of them, and I have them over there, but World Bank, UNDP, UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNIDO, Global Knowledge Partnership, Markle Foundation, and 4 other that I'm not going to think of, but yeah.
You will find, if you analyze the Brazilian situation, that it's rather similar, because they also don't care for social, for other issues. They begin to care for health, which is absolutely right. They begin to care for education, but not in the sense like, for instance, the Indian IT societies and the enterprises which have a program, IT for the masses. And this is a declared program, strongly supported also by the state governments, not only by the national government. So from that point, I think India is very likely to change faster, but nevertheless, the rural areas are strongly underdeveloped, although there are excellent projects, not only Kerala, but also others.
I'd love to talk to you about Brazil offline.
Can we have the report, the URL for your report, the full report?
Yeah, I have a full paper that I wrote, so I'd be happy to share that now.
All right, thank you. Okay, so the next speaker is Casper Jensen.
I think we should just leave that be. Leave it be, yeah. I think it's going to be like this, that we're in. We're in a strange situation here that while high-tech works well, low-tech has failed us. So our nice pictures from Peruvian internet cafes will be missed. So on the bright side, Jennifer will be happy to recognize that our presentation is even less colorful than hers. The paper is called Development in Action on Information Technologies as Globalization Agents, and it's co-written by myself and Peter Lauritz, who's sitting there, and actually reports and reflects on ethnographic studies that he has carried out in Ayacucho in Peru, yet I'll present them as my own here. So, but direct questions in that direction, please. I think in general, one could say that we're taking a slightly more bottom-up approach to a number of the issues which have also exercised previous speakers in this session and many speakers throughout this conference. And I think just as a setup, I would say that our kinds of analysis, I take them to connect with the kinds of analysis and analytical interests that have been presented, among other people, by Alvaro de Miranda yesterday, and by Paul Wouters and Katie Van this morning. But so on that note, I'll talk about some examples from, reflect on some experiences and observations from Peru, but first I'll give a little bit of theoretical setup. So social scientific investigations of technological, economical, political, and cultural processes of change, as we know, are often analyzed in terms of globalization. Globalization, in turn, has been famously defined in terms of an increasing compression of time and space, notably, especially in recent years, enabled by information technologies. By using such technologies, it becomes possible to act at a distance, and symbols, money, and ideologies are sent into global circulation. As a consequence, the world seems smaller, which has led some analysts to argue that the notion of the global village has been actualized. Meanwhile, critics point out that globalization implies stratification and hierarchization, and that large portions of humanity are marginalized in the process. For example, sociologist Zygmunt Bauman describes the emergence of a globalized elite distanced from a localized underclass, and Manuel Castells uses the term the black holes of globalization about areas excluded from development. In much research and public debate, globalization is described as a process which, with a high degree of automatism, changes the lives of many people. If this is the case, the obvious task for research becomes one of evaluating the positive and negative consequences of this process. This understanding, however, takes for granted a dichotomy between the global and the local. On the one hand, local people are viewed as cut off from a flow of goods or information, for example, but through development and an increasing use of ICTs, they might become able to enter this flow. On the other hand, globalization itself is often presented as coming from nowhere in particular, although it almost always has Western roots. As has often been remarked, the West is thereby made to function as the unmarked category of the global. So in the following, we report on an ethnographic study of IT use in Ayacucho, Peru, which rather than considering globalization in the abstract, encountered it in the shape of concrete projects. We use examples from this study to question the received view of globalization and to argue for the need for more nuanced understandings of so-called globalization processes. And we argue further that research at the intersection of science and technology studies, development studies, and cultural anthropology are ideally suited to engage in this task. So a few more remarks first. The dualist conception of the global and the local creates, we think, two blind spots for globalization research. First, because it is premised on the idea that many localities are separated from the global world, the job for development is to construct linkages and infrastructures which will bring them into contact. However, this analytical stance makes invisible the translocal and colonial histories which have deprived and detached many of these areas in the first place. This is problematic from a scholarly point of view, but also practically because it enables developers to imagine large parts of the world as a level playing ground ready for development, rather than as a densely textured cultural and political environment which has already encountered multiple interventions throughout its history. In short, the development discourse constructs actors in non-Western localities as systematically more detached than is the empirical case. In opposition to this conception of locality, the global is often understood as a process which does not belong in any specific place. At the same time, the West is inevitably conceived as the origin point of globalization, whereby the US, Western Europe, or Japan come to represent globality, while the rest of the world is seen as consisting in local areas and regions. This viewpoint in turn deletes the specificity of Western history, economics, and culture, and turns it into a generalizable scheme which can and perhaps ought to be implemented globally. As a consequence, institutions such as the World Bank and NGOs often present themselves as entities which have been formed for no other reason than to ensure technological and economical progress around the world. These development actors are thereby systematically made to appear without context, thus global. The combined results of these two blind spots is that much of the world can be viewed as relatively backwards and helpless, while development can be described simply as a benign agent of change, notably through so-called technology transfer. As social anthropologist James Ferguson says, this turns development into an anti-politics machine in discourse, although one with serious political implications in practice. So based on this, there's a need for globalization research, we think, that's not based on the split between the local and the global, an approach which pays much more attention to empirical detail. Such attention is among the main strengths of social anthropology and science and technology studies. In these approaches, globalization is seen as made up in patchy social, cultural, economical, and political processes, rather than imagined as abstract processes which can be rationally planned and implemented. In anthropology, Anna Tsing's evocative phrase, globalization is not delivered whole and round like a pizza to be munched and dismantled by the hungry margins. Rather than juxtaposing the global with the local, she suggests considering the concrete ways in which organizations and people attempt to construct some actors as global and others as local with various degrees of success. She suggests that studies of globalization would benefit from two analytical principles, and I quote here. She says, first, I paid close attention to ideologies of scale, that is, cultural claims about locality, regionality, and globality. I would track rhetorics of scale as well as contests over what will count as relevant scales. Second, instead of looking for world-wrapping evolutionary stages, logics, and epistemes, I would begin by finding what I call projects, that is, relatively coherent bundles of ideas and practices as realized in particular times and places. The choice of what counts as a project depends on what one is trying to learn about, but in each case to identify projects is to maintain a commitment to localization, even on the biggest world-making dreams and schemes. End quote. This is a view of globalization and development as projects of scale-making in which both developers and developed actors participate, although certainly not on equal terms. Yet the fact that all actors engage in making scales offer plenty of space for the emergence of unforeseen results, and thereby gives development research and practice a chance to emerge from the shadows of inevitability hovering around globalization as a phenomenon. Examples from an ethnography of development and internet use in Peru, from Peter's ethnography, aim to illustrate how attention to the scale-making activities of actors enables globalization research to avoid the global-local dichotomy and thereby escape from these shadows.